Hello, everyone, and welcome to Manifest Equity, our conversation series on how equity, inclusion, diversity, and justice are influencing the world as it changes rapidly, and conversations with thought leaders and practitioners on what they are seeing and how we might move forward in the best way possible. Today, I am exceedingly excited to welcome Becky Christensen and Ebony Walden, two dynamic women who I've had the distinct pleasure of working with over the years. I'm really excited to get into a conversation with them as they are change makers and have been very active in work somewhat similar to my own for a good number of years. Welcome, Ebony and Becky.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So glad to be here.
Awesome.
Thanks.
So Ebony, I'd love to start with you. If you would like to share with folks how you contribute to our ecosystem and what is your passion in the world.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tiffany. So my name is Ebony Walden. Like you said, I'm the owner of a small consulting firm in Richmond called Ebony Walden Consulting. And my passion is urban planning and particularly working at the intersection of race and place. So with my business, I particularly help organizations think about how to create more just and inclusive communities. And that's really focusing on the strategy part, community engagement, and work around racial equity. So putting all of those things together, how do race and place come together? And how do we create better communities that work not just for the rich and people that have access, but for all of us?
Amazing, amazing. And I've loved getting to work with you over the years. We've worked on a few projects together, and your experience and perspective in the planning space where it intersects with the race space just creates such a dynamic set of variables and influences that are really, really valuable. So thank you for the work that you do.
Absolutely.
And welcome. Becky Christensen, goodness gracious, we also go way, way back. Tell these wonderful folks about the work that you do in the world and what you are passionate about.
Yeah, and also I with Ebony have a little bit of a past. So this is a very cool conversation to me. Well, it's interesting, Tiffany, because I think my path has taken a couple of right turns in the road here and there. And what started out as a local government kind of a job, but it really escalated into disparity issues, specifically around affordable housing and other community development. I currently work for a local health system as the director of community health. And in that role, we are able to bring front and center access to health for those that do not have access, and there's plenty of those in our community. We also were able to invest in nonprofit organizations that are affecting the social determinants of health. So that one of those right turns was going from pure community development, the bricks and sticks side, which had a community engagement side to it, but then learning this wealth of information about how people are living and how people in different zip codes have different life expectancies. And you know, it is just like Ebony said, place really does matter, and people having a voice in the solution side of it and becoming engaged in a way that their home and their hopes and dreams come about. It's a long race. It's very complex, but that's my work, and I'm very, very excited about healthy neighborhoods, making healthy neighbors. And I'm really excited to be a part of creating opportunities for people to connect so that they can do it together.
And it's so incredibly fascinating because, you know, as I continue to encounter people who don't know that race is a social construct, it just blows my mind. And so these data-driven, reality-based ideas that things like your zip code can absolutely influence your health and well-being are concepts that everyone should know, but sadly, most people do not. So the work that you all do is so incredibly important, where we're connecting place to, you know, people's well-being and all kinds of outcomes. Mm-hmm. So as we, you know, there are a couple of frameworks that I like to introduce in these conversations. And the first one is, you know, the reason that we're having this manifest equity conversation is because based on the work that we all do, we are witnessing some really incredible things. And I say incredible as in unbelievable, not so much in the good way, right? So we are watching the very equity-based challenges that we've been working on for years just be laid bare in front of our society in a way that further marginalizes and creates additional vulnerabilities for the folks who are least represented, who don't really have voices that are respected and heard and privileged. So I'm very curious to hear from each of you, and I'll start with you, Ebony. You know, as you are watching this pandemic unfold and seeing the impacts and as they intersect with the work that you do, what is it that you're noticing, and that what's kind of the cause for concern, or what you would want to lift up for people?
Absolutely. I think that all of this really highlights my work around race and place. As you said, your race and your zip code has everything to do with your access to resources, to everything from your life expectancy. So the pandemic has just highlighted the reality that lots of us live in, and it's just manifesting like throughout our country through COVID-19. So where you live, and if you're a Black or brown person, really impacts, you know, the resources you have and your likelihood of contracting this potentially deadly disease, right? And so we know that particularly in low-income African-American communities and other communities of color, there are already existing health, income, and wealth disparities in those communities, and they're being hard hit because of that, access to both privilege and health and just the ability to work from home, right? Like a lot of people don't have that, have made those communities harder hit. And that's exactly what we're seeing. Like all of those disparities are being lifted up and just exacerbated, and calling attention to those, calling attention to, right? Like who has privileges and who does not, who has access to everything from, you know, I have access. If I want to go get some groceries, I can hop in my car and go to the grocery store. But what if taking the bus was your only access to getting groceries, right? And in places like New York, where my family lives, like only 10 people can get on the bus at a time if that's your primary point of contact. Also housing, of like who, this is all impacting your ability to have stable housing, your ability to pay for housing if your income's been hit. We know that is an issue for Black and brown communities as well as the impact on African-American businesses. Just think about a lot of the communities I work in, they're already like distressed communities with distressed corridors, and lots of the businesses are there are hair salons and barbershops, right? Are they going to be able to weather the storm of this? And that's going to impact community, because these are already communities where there's a lot of empty storefronts. Will we have those vacant storefronts? So those are just like access issues, whether it's access to testing sites, access to healthcare. Do I have access to technology? Do I have the privilege of being an essential worker or not? And we know that's the vast preponderance of those people are Black and brown community members as well. And so even everything about this pandemic has to do with access, racial equity and inequities, and how those are manifested in our society. So I think this is a time, I did a training last week where it was on racial equity. And I probably pulled 15 headlines from the New York Times, the Washington Post, about what are the different ways, many of them that I mentioned, that this is impacting Black and brown communities to a greater degree than white communities. And it's just so like, I had so much information to pull from. And in some ways, you know, it's making something that's already bad worse. In other ways, it's really, you can't ignore it, right? It's calling attention to something. So this is really an opportunity to say, these things already exist. Let's be proactive and targeted in our approach to advancing racial equity.
That's amazing. And, since you come from such a well-rounded set of perspectives, I would love for you to, potentially share with us, as when we share this link out, some resources that you go to, because the information situation is really challenging to navigate, right?
Absolutely.
We all want to have good information, but there's so much out there. There's so much bad information. So we would love to know, like, you don't have to tell us now, but
Yeah,
we'd love to populate a couple of resources that are kind of go-to resources for you, because I have, from knowing you a great many years, I am pretty sure that the resources that you're looking to are fairly reliable. So
absolutely.
that'd be awesome. Thank you. So how about you, Becky?
Yeah, I mean, I'm hearing Ebony, and I just totally connect with it, and I connect with the fact that it's interesting when you watch the news and you see the human stories, and you're realizing, there's people that are being honored for being on those front lines, and there's some that really have to be there because that front line wouldn't exist without all the support systems that go with it.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think it's like this double-edged situation for hourly workers and people of color that, they have a job, but the job is so risky. And so they have to make this choice to be out in the community. They're glad to get a paycheck, but what does that really mean for exposure, especially if one has a chronic disease, if they have asthma, if they have heart issues, if they suffer from diabetes? These are very prevalent in these communities. And we know that the coronavirus is very harsh for people who have these. So, they talk about the people who advise us about how to take care of ourselves. They say, you stay home. You stay home if you have these chronic conditions. Well, I'm going to stay home, but I know there's so many that can't,
mm-hmm.
that won't. And so I think we're putting people in a situation because otherwise there is no money. I think in our community, there was this great rising up around issues about food access. It was interesting to me that was zeroed in on, and I don't know if it's been totally addressed, but I've seen it happen on multiple fronts. I'm very thankful for it. And especially with the school situation and whether kids could get food at school, and now with no school, how can they get it? All that's good. But, there's a lot of other needs going on, and the voices aren't there to talk about it. And so I just want to say that's something that's weighing heavy on my heart because it's not being talked about. And the other related thing to that has to do with trauma. And we know that trauma happens in our communities that already have other high stresses around poverty or economic disparity, around safety. We know this, all kinds of things with behavioral health and substance abuse. Well, the numbers have actually been going down about those services being accessed. And I can't help but wonder about it. I can't help but wonder, are people kind of shutting down and staying in and keeping it quiet and hidden because they don't feel like they have a place to go? And I feel like people with fewer choices, that this is probably more the case. And so I fear for the stories that are gonna come out of our communities when we're out of the crisis. You see what we see on the news, and I'm not taking away from anything good that people are doing and saving lives, all of it. It's hero stuff. But there's another side to this, and we know it. We know it. And I'm going to say one more quick thing, and this is around a community development principle that I learned a long time ago in working in disadvantaged communities all over Virginia, Tiffany. And that is that if it is a depressed community economically, and the country or the state goes through an economic dip like we're having now, there is no coming back or reopening. It was already It was already in a deep disparity place. And so we saw this coming out of the 2008 real estate bust. The recovery was very spotty. And where there was high property values, it came back faster. Where there wasn't, guess what? No. And so again, we're not stuff so much now, but there's a whole layer of this work that will have to kick in when we're past the crisis.
Yeah. So there are two things that I want to touch on from what you said. The first one on the essential worker piece. And, you know, in the work that I do in diversity, equity, and inclusion focused on the workplace, this is something that causes me a great deal of concern, because the idea that human equity is important, right, is something that's really serious. And the idea that we are now forcing people to choose between their employment and potentially their lives, to me, is just like that. It's unfathomable that that's the reality that we're facing. As we see these states beginning to slowly open up, et cetera, we are then further removing the opportunities that people have to collect unemployment or to safely maintain at home, because as long as their places of employment are suddenly designated open for business, then their options shut down. So that is something that is of great concern to me, because I'm part of the B Corp movement, and the idea that people are expendable, this is just unacceptable to me, utterly unacceptable. So as we move into the next part of the conversation, that's something that I really need for our world to privilege human existence and human well-being far more than we currently are. The second thing is on the traumas, the internal traumas, right? I'm a domestic violence survivor, and that's something that is just also weighing very heavily on my heart, right? So the people, the men and women and children who are being abused are trapped, not safely, indoors with their abusers. And I think, like, I was aware of the increased rates around sort of mental health issues and alcoholism and things like that. I was not aware that the usage of the services that exist to support people in trauma were on the decline. So thank you for teaching me something. And it does make sense to me, because I remember when I lived in Jackson Ward, and I called the police, and after something bad had happened and I needed someone to come to me, it took them so long to get to my door that by the time they were ready to show up, I had to say, please, for the love of God, don't come now, because the person is in the house with me now. Right. And so calling for assistance is not something that is easy to do when you are trapped with your abuser. So I would hope that, those of us who live in communities who are aware of the people who are around us, if you live in an apartment building and you're hearing something, if you live in a walkable neighborhood and you're aware that something's going on, please do what you can to try to be there for your neighbors, because they might not be able to be there for themselves at this time. And it is, in fact, a very dangerous situation.
Yeah, I want to just put a little exclamation point on that. The way that issue was raised to me initially, I worked with the forensic nursing unit over at St. Mary's, and I've learned a lot from them, but this actually came from a school teacher. And what she said to me was, we miss our children. We miss not being able to teach, but mostly our teachers, they knew the children they needed to keep an eye on in their classrooms, because they knew there was a problem at home, and they can't do it now. And somehow that really, that came in for me really loud and clear, that who's watching those children right now.
Yeah. The very folks who are creating the pain for them. And so, just to reiterate for the folks who, who need to know and who are, willing to provide information and help other people, those services are still available. The domestic violence hotline, the child abuse hotline, all of the various social services that exist to support people through these things are still working. And that might be the other issue, is that people might not assume that those agencies and those entities are still available for support. And we need to make sure that they know.
Yeah, a lot of them have gone teleconferencing kind of they have to protect their staff, so it's very understandable, but it's not perfect.
No, not at all. All right, so I did tell you earlier before we started recording, Becky, that I'm a time traveler. So now we're going to travel through time because, you know, we don't have the ability to predict the future, but we can create it. And I'm very much interested in this idea of, you know, of using narrative and creating our way forward into a better future. This is a major inflection point that, you know, like certain elections that we've had over the years, create such a disturbance in the forest, such a crescendo, whichever side people sit on, whichever election you want to think about. It creates a set of circumstances that, regardless of what you believe, you can no longer ignore what is happening around you. And that's what's happening now. I don't care who you are, where you live, it is impossible to remain entirely unaffected, which means that we have the collective attention of humanity. And so for those of us who have access to some kinds of levers of change, I think that it's important that we take hold of narrative and begin to create into the future that we want. Like, one of the exercises that I'm engaging in with my clients is, like, we know that we know that every organization, every institution, for instance, is going to have a coronavirus social distancing period narrative. There will be a story that will be told about how we handled that. And so what I'm personally empowering my clients to do is to take control of that narrative now. And while you cannot predict the variables, we already have the beginning of the story. We know how we got here, and we know what early choices we've made. But we can now begin to set up some parameters for how we'd like the rest of it to go. So rather than feeling reactive and powerless, we can say, like for me at TMI Consulting, it is imperative to me that my team members feel like they're not alone, right? Like, their humanity matters, their well-being matters. So every decision that I make, I can layer through that lens of, does this make my team know that they are supported? If it doesn't, I'm not interested in that particular behavior. So taking control of that narrative allows us to lay a framework that we can then go back and fill with how things actually played out, but it gives us a little bit of agency. So I'd love to hear from each of you, and starting with Ebony. As we imagine a future going forward, we're all watching this unfold. From the work that you've done in the world, what do you feel like either will fundamentally change or will need to change as we reconstruct better ways of doing things?
Yeah, I think this is a real opportunity if we take it, right? So this is exacerbated and brought to light so many racial disparities and place-based disparities. And so I think it's an opportunity, I like the word that you said, to use a new lens, right? So we have the opportunity with every decision we make, whether you're in an organization or community institution, or even a lot of our elected officials that are making decisions that will impact people's lives. Here's an opportunity to put on a racial equity lens for your decision making. And I have like 4 or 5 questions that people can ask themselves to really put on this lens, right? So if you're making a decision, you have a new project, a new program, an initiative, or you're thinking about just how you are going to change things, you know, what you do or your work during COVID, I think essential question is who benefits and who's going to be burdened by this decision that I'm about to make, right? And so you're paying attention to how is this going to impact people and making sure that the people that are most disproportionately impacted don't have that you're not burdening people, right? And you're not benefiting people that are already benefiting. What would have happened, right? If the people that needed their money the most in the stimulus, that made below the poverty line or got their money first, that would have made too much sense of like taking that, like who's benefiting and who is burdened. Why is it not really strategic of like, we want to make sure these people get their money first. They'll probably have the less sort of bandwidth to weather this. We want to give them their money first. So just asking yourself that question would help. How do you center the voices of those that are most negatively impacted? So voice and engaging with communities that are impacted to co-create solutions. A lot of time we do things for communities and not with them, and they are the expert on their own experience and how to navigate their lives. And so how do we center their voices and their experience in that? And how do we mitigate those impacts that might have occurred, right? So asking for like who's benefiting and who burdened. We don't live in a perfect world, but there are ways that which we can mitigate those impacts. And then targeting solutions so that we are prioritizing the people that are most vulnerable in the situation. So like I said, that would have been a whole different paradigm. We're going to prioritize people that are at the lower income of the spectrum to get their money first. How are we thinking about that with future aid packages? With how are we disseminating testing? Where these testing sites are? Of course, the first couple of weeks of COVID, you're hearing about all these celebrities that got tested, right? So they have access to resources and things. And we're like, where are they getting these tests and from, right? So it's a whole about money, power, and privilege thing. So can we have more testing in our communities at places where people really feel comfortable accessing them? It's about location. And I think it's an opportunity to, now that we're highlighting these inequities, to continue to capture data around them of like, can we capture data of who's getting tested, who is not getting tested, who is testing positive, where are they testing positive, what communities, and that can help us really have a targeted and place-based response around location, who, what, and where, and really supporting the grassroots, and this is from a philanthropic, supporting the grassroots organizations that are there on the ground in the community doing the work. And I think for my work, it'll be interesting. I do a lot of community engagement work, helping with already sort of what they call underrepresented groups, and really about public decision making about the future resources as it relates to place. So we're going to have the opportunity to get real creative of how we engage people in these community change making process. People didn't want to come to meetings when it was regular life going on. So they're really not going to want to come to meetings and anybody in groups of 10. So we have to be really creative about what are the ways in which we're engaging people now about critical decisions about our community that still need to get made. Can we use phones? Can we go online? Are there other ways? Can we do some mail? How about the U.S. postal system, right? So the creative ways, I think, they're doing the census. And so thinking about how do we really get deeper into communities where we really need to hear these people's voices around how we're going to grow and change their community. So those are just like a couple of things I think will change. Another thing to watch, I think, will be what's the impact of COVID on the housing market? Particularly, that's going to be interesting. So we know we've stopped evictions. I think that actually led up. So we know that people's income is being impacted in sort of from the rental situation. But what's going to happen in our communities in the homeowner situation? Are we going to have another instance of what happened with the Great Recession? I'm really interested in how it's going to impact housing prices, home ownership, as well as the rental market, because there's another people, are we going to house the homeless and those that are negatively impacted? So lots of questions, lots of things to watch, but I think it's an opportunity for us to be more creative and us to have targeted solutions that really say who's the most vulnerable in these situations and in our communities, and how do we prioritize their needs and get them the resources and access to both information, resources, and really healthcare that they need, and housing.
Yeah, it's so interesting. One of the best metaphors that I've heard about all of this is we're all in the same storm, but we're not in the same boat, right? So some of us are rolling around in yachts and all kinds of leisure and entertainment on board with us and support, right? Versus some of us are in dinghies with holes in the bottom trying to keep the water from overtaking it, because there's some misguided notions also out there that everyone is equally impacted, which is absolutely demonstrably false. So one of the things that I'm hoping to see is that this is a really poignant demonstration of how inextricably linked our lives are, right?
Mm-hmm.
So a handful of people make some poor decisions around wanting to congregate without masks on and, licking the fence post or whatever, and so many other lives are impacted. So, there are some aspects of this that I find utterly fascinating, because sometimes change doesn't happen until it hits your back door step, right? And so now we have a situation where people, were apathetic and just didn't want to hear about the suffering of others and how other people were doing. And suddenly, how our nation and how our society takes care of the least of us, takes care of any of us when we are unwell, under-resourced, or in need of some kind of assistance. Suddenly that conversation matters to a lot more people, because people who never expected to find themselves in vulnerable positions are now vulnerable. And it doesn't bring me any kind of joy that more people had to hurt in order for this to happen. But by gosh, I certainly hope that we're able to take this moment and recognize that no one is truly immune, and that we really do need to take care of each other collectively as a society. The idea that nutrition is tied for children to their education, and that healthcare is tied to people's employment, is ludicrous. That makes no sense. We are the wealthiest nation around. We have the capacity to feed and clothe and house and take care of all of our people. What we have created was by design. What we have created was a set of choices that landed us here. And so what I want to empower, those of us who are participating in this work, and those who are watching and listening, what we need to understand is that each of us has some capacity, however small, to influence the system in a way where we are empowered to make new choices. Everything from, the basic choice to make a vote and pay attention to who's advocating for what and who's advocating for whom, down to your consumer choices, where you spend your money, what you support with your dollars actually influences how businesses go about treating people, right? So we need to be, I think, much more intentional about how we move through the world, who and what we support, and keeping our eyes and ears open for how the rest of us are doing, because we are inextricably linked. We are one human family, and without each other, at the end of the day, we all fall down. Yeah. So on that somber note, Becky.
Well, I think one more thing, and it kind of brings together what I said. I think that it's really around data. And so most likely, I don't know, I hope we don't have another pandemic, but even climate change is happening, sort of natural disasters and happening. We actually have the capacity to map in our communities. So the City of Richmond, their sustainability office, I'm working on a project with them, but they created an equity index where they took the 39 factors that will make particular places in our community more vulnerable to a climate change event, right? Wow. And so they map those particular communities, and then they're going to go through a process, which I'm going to be helping them with, to say, in the event that something happened, how do we respond to these events and actually prioritize the people that are most vulnerable? And I think it's an opportunity for every city to do. What if we mapped on our city, based on research, evidence-based factors, who are going to be the most vulnerable people if we have a city or national crisis? And then from that mapping, we can really tailor what resources and services we're going to need, and how are we going to get them to people quickly. So whether it's a coronavirus or another Katrina-like event, we're not seeing the most vulnerable the most negatively impacted, right? We forethought. So whether it's a climate change event or a natural disaster or a pandemic or health disaster, we already have that information, and we have the tentacles to get into the community and get the resources to the people that need it the most fast, right? And I think that's another opportunity that any city can do, that of how do we create an equity index, right? So we know who's the most vulnerable, where they are, and we can get services to them fast. And we can also create tentacles and lifelines between trusted community members and empower those in the community to also be a part of that change as well. So I think that's a huge opportunity.
No, I love that, Ebony, because what we're seeing right now is a dearth of leadership at the national level. Even the idea that some states are going to open while other states are not going to open. Our land mass is so vast that we are, when what happens in one place is going to slowly but definitely affect the rest of the country. We don't have a unified leadership presence with any kind of wisdom or intelligence guiding us. And so the idea of local solution finding and localities taking care of their own residents and citizens is incredibly powerful. And I think that, the way forward includes a lot more of that. Like, that is an empowering solution that doesn't leave you so vulnerable to, the whims of leadership. I love it.
I like that too, Ebony. That mapping sounds really helpful.
Every city has the equity index, but go ahead,
okay.
Becky.
Okay. So I'm just going to tie into the beginning of this question with you, Tiffany, where you're a time traveler. Let's just start there. But it's actually going to weave in, and I have this little orange piece of paper, and I have all happy things at the top, and I have all scary things at the bottom. Well, I thought I was going to go to the scary things second, but now I'm just going to tie right in because you all have already launched all the scary things. So I'll just, chime in, but then I'll go to a happier place. And that's where I'll finish the question about looking forward. Because for sure, unfortunately, this coronavirus, the response to the coronavirus, the decision about resources and rules have become a political football. And it's ridiculous. And it's ridiculous to the extent that people are losing their lives over it, and we know a lot more will. And so we need some courageous leadership that will say the right thing, whether they get elected or not. And we need to at least, I can't define the qualities that gets a person into national politics and what they have to be willing to say to get where they get. I imagine it's difficult and trying, but come on, this is an unusual time. And if a person was ever going to say and do the right thing, we're there. And to put a dot point on that, let's go ahead and address the guns and the NRA being behind these public outcries of opening businesses. Come on. It's ridiculous. It's manipulative. It's playing to the base fears of people, and it's dangerous. And we've got to do better. And it cannot, it cannot be that free speech allows people to destroy other citizens. It just can't be. And so I don't know, this whole thing about how we've gone from a political football to now violence and potential violence and fear, and now this economic fear that's been put in the hearts of everyone, and created all kinds of craziness around these approaches instead of a sound approach about bringing back our economy. This is all, it did not have to be this way. And it's been made worse by people in power. Okay, so what was at the top of my piece of paper was that, and I think you said this in the beginning, Tiffany, is we need to be different with each other. And one of the things that maybe for some people, and maybe more than some, maybe some hearts have been changed, or people have been able to see while they're stuck in their own homes, how other people are stuck in theirs. And yeah, you're right, Ebony, you can go to the grocery store and maybe others cannot, but we all have this limitation around us now, and we need to have a lot more care for really belonging to each other, because someone else's suffering needs to be front and center for me so that we as a community can move forward. And we're not there yet, but I think, when you talk about what is the future state, I don't know all the steps in the how, but what I do know is that we've got to be able to articulate where we want to land. And I think one place we definitely want to land is being a country and a world that is kinder and that is looking out for the most vulnerable. And whether that comes from just having greater empathy for your own situation or your faith base, or just sort of finally getting it because of all the suffering that you've observed, I just think it's important. And then finally, just like on a real practical level, I think some of the initial steps when we get past the crisis is to really look at dedicating resources to building capacity. And so the capacity, y'all mentioned this already, you know, our organizations, I'm thinking about our nonprofit organizations and even our large companies, we weren't ready for this. And so thinking a little more strategically about the way in which we can spend our time, our planning resources, money, to do something quite extraordinary that will help our future not be so chaotic. I think it should. And so I'm hoping, you know, people talk about getting back to the way it was. I hope we don't. I just hope we don't. I hope we'll just take a spot of time and focus on this preparation work and this appreciation work and do something that maybe will make the world look a little different.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that, you know, there are different parts of the world where, you know, people are looking at us in Europe and other places and they're going, wait, what? People can't get health care because they lost their job? Like, that doesn't even make sense. Don't you value human life? Our decisions and our systems and structures evidence that we do not value human life, at least not equitably. And I wholeheartedly agree that the status quo, returning to the old normal, should not even be an option, because we are looking at legacies of patriarchal systems and the delusion of white supremacy and all kinds of stuff that was never designed to serve the people who are currently on the margins. So hopefully we move to something that is entirely different. We have that opportunity, but unfortunately that the status quo, the default, the rut that we were in is exactly where we'll find ourselves going closer to if our people don't stand up and say that we demand something different, right? So ultimately we have more agency than we feel like we do. And again, those of us who have access to the levers of power need to be using them now. But we need to be empowering people across the board to say enough is enough. Like I should not, my body should not be expendable because I'm an essential worker. Oh, and also the people who are suddenly designated as the essential workers are among the worst compensated and least appreciated in our society. How do those things line up? They do not, right?
Right.
Unbelievable.
Unbelievable.
So I would love to close with any resources that you want to point people to. If there's any project that you're currently working on, or something that is currently giving you life, whether it's a blog or a periodical or something that you've written in the world. But is there anything, any final thought or resource that you'd like to leave people with? And if you don't have one now, we'll certainly leave that later in the link if you think of something later.
Go ahead. Okay, thank you. I don't have a specific project I'd like to lift up, but what I would like to do is encourage anyone that, I mean, I can't believe the three of us are the only people who are having these thoughts or the passion around it. I think a lot of us are very concerned. And I therefore think there will be something that will begin to emerge this summer and this fall. And I think participation in conversations is going to be really important. But like Ebony said, it's not always about the meeting and getting folks out. I mean, that's the old way of thinking too. So I think we've got to get into a different mindset about getting data gathered about what's been going on here, and then get, you know, even the trauma informed work that, you know, that can be backfilled. They can go back and find out what went on. And I think there's going to be opportunities to build on that, to create some opportunities for the future in the way we build capacity. So I just want to encourage people to be engaged with that. That's what I'm passionate about for the future.
I love it. Thank you, Becky.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll highlight a couple of things. And so I like, some of them are information that I like, go-to sources for information around the issues that I care about. So I follow the Brookings Institute. They have great studies. Usually they come out in Washington Post, but particularly tracking data and studies and issues around race. Probably almost every other day, things have been coming out. And so I just love to sort of go to their website and browse around keeping up to date on what's going from a data standpoint. And then I'm city focused, right? So City Lab and Next City will like get stories around place that has to do with what is going on in our cities around the country. They have positive exposés, but they also have like highlighting issues that impact place, and particularly around equity. I think the Race Forward is another sort of leading organization that does a lot of work around race, and they have racial equity impact assessments, sort of this tool that this lens. And so if folks are interested in digging more deeper in that, they have some resources. And then two organizations or projects I want to highlight. So the equity index that I was talking about that was developed by the City of Richmond Sustainability Office, it's in relation to this project called RBA Green 2050. I think it's a really good example of how to do a community engagement process and planning process with a racial equity lens. And that's why they came up with that index. It's the only kind of tool that I've seen in work around cities where they took all these factors and said, this is who's the most vulnerable and this is who we're going to prioritize. And then I'm on the board of this organization called Virginia Community Voice, and they're doing a lot of good work around how do you do sort of equity in communities, but particularly around highlighting and prioritizing the voice of those that are most negatively impacted, particularly in Richmond. But I think they do a wonderful job in let's think about equity and inclusion, about who participates and power and who gets to decide how our communities grow and are shaped and changed from the bottom up approach. And so I love their work. And so those are just some examples of both where I go for information, but inspirational projects that I just think that are doing really good work.
That's amazing. Thank you. And Ebony, would you be able to assist a city if they wanted to create an equity index? Is that something that your consulting firm might be able to help folks do?
Sure, I love that. This is like my new passion of thinking about how do we do this in other places around the country.
Fantastic. I love it. So I will leave one, and I'm going to go in a completely different direction. I am very much enjoying something called the Nap Ministry on Instagram.
This sounds good to me. Go ahead.
Okay, exactly. Now, this is definitely something that has been created kind of by and for people of color specifically, but everyone can benefit from it. And the idea is that we've all been bamboozled by the delusion of white supremacy and the idea of professionalism and hustle, 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 rat race, and we deserve better. And so the Nap Ministry is really privileging this idea that we must take care of our minds, our bodies, and our souls. Like while we are trapped indoors or whatever for this pandemic, a lot of, you see a lot of news telling you that you need to write the book, you need to be productive, you need to finish that project. BS, right? If you have the energy and the spoons, that's a disability reference for those of you that don't know it. If you have, all of the motivation to do those things, great, more power to you. But if you don't, that is also okay, because we are not working from home. We are at home trying to get work done during a pandemic. It is hard, it is emotionally stressful, and it's affecting us in ways that we probably won't even be able to enumerate until we're on the other side. So the Nap Ministry, follow it on Instagram. It's really cool. And like getting those naps in the middle of the day at any time that you can is absolutely medicine, and you deserve it. So everybody take good care of yourselves. Becky and Ebony, thank you so much for joining me today for another episode of Manifest Equity. Have everyone take good care of yourselves.
All right. Thank y'all.
Thank you.